This week's lecture focuses on the characteristics of effective learning environments. What do you, as a teacher, need to have in place, either in your classroom or across a whole school, that creates a space or an environment where your students can learn effectively? This diagram or model, the Effective Schools model, was produced for the Victorian Department of Education and provides an interesting and useful framework for thinking about what makes an effective learning environment. And I particularly wanted to focus on a couple of areas that really relate to your role as a teacher, and we'll get to these one by one. Let's have a little think about these ones over here, where there is purposeful teaching. This is something that I talk about a lot in my classes. As a teacher, you need to know exactly why you do everything that you do in a classroom. Everything that you do, every word that you say, every gesture that you make, every lesson that you plan must have a clear and articulated purpose. You need to be able to identify why it is that you do the things that you do. So purposeful teaching is really crucial. There's a strong focus on teaching and learning across a school. So there's a shared focus within the staff about what makes for effective teaching and learning. Over here, this one's really important as well, that you need to develop a stimulating and secure learning environment. And I'm going to come back to the idea of a secure or a safe and supportive learning environment in a couple of minutes. But I think that there is a link between the stimulating learning environment and having high expectations. It's about setting challenges for your students. And I think this one as well, establishing a learning community where students feel safe and supported in their learning, is also really important. One of the foundational elements of an effective learning environment is that of safety. And safety can take on a number of different aspects. There's some physical safety, which is a really important responsibility or a duty of care that we have as teachers to ensure that our students remain physically safe. On the 24th of March, we have a guest lecture from the Australian Education Union who will come and talk to you about your legal and ethical responsibilities, including what you are required to do in order to keep your students safe. Safety refers to safety inside the classroom, so things like making sure that there is ease of access or in and out and around the classroom, around the tables and chairs in the classroom, that there's no cords, all the normal occupational health and safety issues that you would expect. Safety in the schoolyard is also really important. Think of the SunSafe programs in primary schools. Safety from unwanted visitors to the school. Many of you will have heard of the recent spate of bomb threats or terrorism threats that probably close to 100 schools across New South Wales and Victoria have been the recipients of. And schools have very clearly defined emergency shutdown procedures. In fact, one of the guest speakers at our recent orientation day for our Bachelor of Education students only the day before had to stay locked down in her classroom with children hidden in cupboards and under desks and around the corner for an hour and a half until the all clear was given. Physical safety is a really important issue. Things like stranger danger, I suppose, keeping out those unwanted and uninvited visitors to schools. Making sure the furniture is adequate and safe for the children to sit on. School lockers are safe. Carpets don't have holes in them that children can trip over. The normal occupational health and safety issues. Cyber safety is also a really critical issue, and you will address this issue in subsequent classes in more details, but it's currently something that you really need to be aware of in how you're keeping the students in your care safe within the online environment within the school. And schools have very well developed policies around cyber safety, at least most of them should have by now. But there's another aspect to safety that is often one that is overlooked, and that's the emotional safety of the students in your classes. Do your students feel safe enough in your classroom to reveal something of themselves? Do they feel comfortable in your classroom to share those ill-formed ideas without fear of humiliation or embarrassment, or of being ridiculed by their peers or even by their teacher? What might you do as a teacher to ensure and to generate this sense of emotional safety that is at the core of being able to learn? Learning is a risky business. As many of you might be experiencing right now, your ideas about teaching are just beginning to be formed. They're ill-formed ideas. And for most of the students in our classrooms, many of their ideas are ill-formed. They don't come knowing everything. So to reveal that they don't quite know or quite understand requires a sense of trust that you have developed within your classroom, within that learning environment. And as a teacher, that's a key responsibility that you have. Getting to know your students and developing a strong rapport and relationship with them is crucial to generating that feeling of emotional safety in the classroom. Setting boundaries around behaviour, and some people might call them rules, others might call them codes of behaviour, or just the way we do things in this classroom. That's a responsibility that you have as well, to set those ground rules and enforce them, to make sure that everybody behaves in a way that respects and values each other and helps everybody in the classroom to feel that emotional safety. Another critical aspect of an effective learning environment is that students in that environment need to feel supported. This links very closely to the idea of having a safe environment. Students need to feel that if they have a problem, they can come to you for support, as if they have a problem with their learning. The problem might result from them having particular needs that might differ from what the norm is, whatever the norm might be constructed as. Or it might just be that they are struggling with the particular concepts that you are trying to teach them and they need additional supports. And we call these supports scaffolding. And they are the things that you, as the more capable peer, might put in place to help the students move from where they currently are with their learning to where you desire them to be. And a scaffold or a support might be as simple as a question. It might be a prompt to a direction towards a useful resource for the students to access that might help them develop that understanding that they're currently stuck on. It might be an alternative activity that addresses the problem from a different perspective, but a perspective that meets the learning needs of that particular learner in your classroom. So being supportive requires that you understand and that you know the students in your class, that you know what their learning preferences and their learning habits might be, and that you plan your activities accordingly to meet those needs, that you differentiate the sorts of learning activities that you have so that each student can be successful and feel supported. Support for students with additional needs is also something that can happen inside the classroom and across a whole school. For example, the Safe Schools Coalition has been in the news quite a lot lately, and is coming under review by some elements of the federal government. Those sorts of programs provide an explicit and important safety or support network for students who might identify as GLTBI. Programs that might support students who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds are also an important support system that schools can put in place. This might be school counselling or chaplaincy programs, or it might be something as straightforward as free fruit or a breakfast program at the school, things that are becoming increasingly common to support the needs of those students. Another important feature of effective learning environments is that they are inclusive. Inclusive classrooms acknowledge that diversity in our classroom exists and that we act in ways that make each student feel accepted and that their differences are accommodated. This particular diagram, whilst one that I've taken from a business context, can still have really strong application in a school setting or an educational setting. So diversity and inclusion at a basic level is on the agenda, but there's no concrete plans. It's often just lip service. As you move up the levels, awareness of diversity at level 2 is recognised as something that is of benefit to a school setting. And you may, a school might deploy initiatives, to use the language of the diagram, at the local level. So we're aware, but diversity and inclusivity need more than awareness. Understanding and application, so that we're actually creating a really inclusive learning environment. This is often where many schools stop in their move towards diversity and inclusion. And we see events like Harmony Day or Multicultural Day that might accommodate for cultural diversity. But diversity can be derived from a variety of different dimensions of difference. It could be somebody's gender, it could be their sexuality, as I referred to in the previous slide around the Safe Schools Coalition and GLDPI students. Diversity might come from religious diversity or ethnic diversity or cultural diversity. It may also come from socioeconomic diversity. And schools need to be inclusive of all children. Setting up excursions every term can act to exclude those students who come from less well-off families who can't afford to have excursions. I know that my stepchildren at the end of each year in secondary school, the final 2, 3, sometimes even 4 weeks seems to stretch out from one excursion and one activity that requires parents to put their hands in their pockets on a continuous basis. And perhaps schools need to think about how inclusive those sorts of programs really are. And the students whose families can't afford those end up having to stay at school or not coming to school at all because they can't afford it. So diversity and inclusion means more than just understanding and having the occasional inclusive activity. It ends up being something that is how things are done at that level 5, that sustainable area. It's part of business as usual. The diversity is embedded. They're not one-off events. Diversity and inclusivity considerations are made for every decision around the school. On the course website, I've put a link to a YouTube video that is an extract from a movie, a very old movie these days, called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I'm sure most of you will be vaguely familiar with it. If you aren't, and if you haven't already looked at it, pause this lecture now and go and have a look at it. It's quite funny, and then come back and resume the lecture. Okay, so now you've had a look and you've had a bit of a laugh. This is definitely not the sort of classroom we want you to be teaching in. Instead, we want you to look at how you move students from this kind of attitude, sleeping on the desk, hands across their mouths, not really focusing. Look at this one, she looks as bored as the proverbial. We want you to move from there to this kind of a classroom environment where students are really engaged. Now, engagement is a really big word that is thrown around quite liberally in teacher speak. But what does it actually mean? What does it mean when we say we want our students to be engaged? Here's a little bit of a definition. The engaged student is attentive in the sense that he or she pays attention to and focuses on the tasks associated with the work that you have set. The engaged student is also committed. They voluntarily use their resources under their control to support the activity called for by the task that you've set. The engaged student is persistent. They stick with the task even when it presents those difficulties. And the engaged student finds meaning and value in the tasks that make up the work. So that's what we mean when we talk about engagement. It's not just about students being quiet and busy. It means that they are really committed to learning and persist with that learning even in the face of challenges. An effective learning environment is one where the students look like this, not like this. And just to make you giggle a little bit, worksheets are not the way to engagement. One of the concerns that I see in some schools, not all, and not in all classrooms, is the preponderance of worksheets and textbook exercises, and they're not engaging. Studies and surveys a few years ago revealed that students' number one hate across primary and secondary schools was the dreaded worksheet. So for goodness sake, to engage your students, don't give them a worksheet. Try and get them to be far more active in their learning rather than passive. Here's another way of looking at engagement and how an engaging learning environment brings together a number of the things that I've already talked about. And probably some of the things that you'll be talking about in your methods courses and in your discipline courses. And it starts up here. It starts up here with knowing your students, and that's the relationship that you have between teacher and student, between you and all of your students. It's not until you know your students that you can really start to engage them. And why is that? Because it's really important over here to connect what you are doing in the classroom to the students' life worlds. What are they doing? What do they bring with them from beyond the classroom that you can tap into as a teacher? So when you're designing your curriculum, your lesson plans, your unit plans, you've got to bring together your knowledge of what the students are capable of doing, what they already know, what their learning habits and preferences are, to things that are happening in their world that they can relate to, either their current world or perhaps their future world, as long as that future world is not too far in the future. And then the third element is the content. What are you setting? What challenge are you setting? And this is sort of the fifth cog of the wheel of effective learning environments, that you're setting an appropriate challenge that builds on their expertise. So it's when you've got good relationships, you're talking about stuff that is relevant, that the students can see as relevant, you're tapping into that expertise that is just beyond what they can do now, not what they've already done because that's boring, not what they don't believe they can do because that's out of reach and will give up, but that appropriate challenge that taps into and extends their expertise. And that's when you'll have engagement, when you've got that level of challenge. Here's another continuum that some of you might be quite interested in looking at. When students are engaged, when they have high levels of attention and high levels of commitment, the behavioural issues in your classroom will be minimal. If they have high attention and low commitment, they're complying with what you're doing, they're being good students who know how to do school, you're starting to come down the behavioural continuum, I guess. Low attention and low commitment, that strikes me as possibly being like the students in a slide a couple of slides ago. They're looking fairly bored, but not necessarily playing up. They then move into retreatism. Might be falling asleep on the desk, but not causing you any great big grief. The final stage of disengaged students is the outright rebellion, a state that you want to do everything in your power to avoid. So I guess the key message here is that engagement is where you want to situate the students in your classroom. You need to be designing curriculum that encourages their commitment and their attention, rather than their attention being diverted and you having chaos ensue in your classroom. So at the core of any pre-service teacher, such as yourselves, is an anxiety around managing inappropriate behaviour in the classroom. If you take nothing else away from this lecture, and I'm trusting that you'll take more than this, but engagement is the key to having a well-behaved classroom. Engagement is the key to having a well-behaved classroom. If you don't have curriculum, activities and learning that engages the students, then no amount of classroom management, behaviour management techniques is going to avoid you spending more time than you need to down this end of the continuum. I can't stress this enough. An engaging curriculum will help you avoid most of the behavioural management problems that occur in classrooms. Having said that, there are some causes of students' inappropriate behaviour that may be somewhat beyond your capacity to address via your curriculum. But have a look at these sorts of things. Boredom, lack of interest for a particular subject or course, inability to establish control, ineffective teaching strategies. Those are all things that are within your purview as a teacher to have an impact about. Having a learning disability is also something that you can address as a teacher by differentiating your curriculum, by giving those students with disabilities something that empowers them to learn at their particular level in their particular way. Some of these things around here are things that you have less impact on. For example, this one here. There's not too much that you can do about their disadvantaged home life other than to try and create a more level playing field in your own classroom. Lack of social skills, lack of self-esteem are things that you can work on in your classroom with those students by helping them to be successful. Again, differentiate the curriculum so that the students have success. I guess one of my overarching messages for what it takes to create an effective learning environment is that it's all a matter of talk. It's a matter of your talk, the talk that a teacher talks. And you have to walk the talk. Oh goodness me, I'm getting too much talky at this point of the evening. Teachers talk in a variety of ways. It's not just the words we say, although they have so much power. We can build a student up with a gesture and a smile and some positive feedback, and we can just as easily cut them down by a sarcastic offhand comment. The tone of voice that we take speaks volumes about what we think. Our body language communicates more than our words can. So be aware that you are communicating even when you're not saying anything. You are talking with your body. Another aspect of communication are the questions that we ask. We can ask questions that intrigue our students, that engender a sense of curiosity and wonder and motivate them to learn. Our questions can also be dismissive and closed and banal. So think about the questions that you ask. And in one of our future online lectures and workshops, we'll be looking at questioning as a key element of teacher talk. The feedback that we give our students is also a way of us communicating and sending messages. And again, we'll talk about feedback in greater detail once you're on placement in one of our online lectures and workshops. The lessons that we plan are also a way of talking to our students, because they tell the students something about what we as teachers value. The sorts of activities that we design for our students tell our students about what we value about learning and about teaching. So when you're preparing to go out on placement, think about all the different ways that you talk to the students, in the words that you say, the questions that you ask, the feedback that you give, the body language that you show, the gestures that you make, the tone of your voice, the facial expressions. They are all forms of talk. And so are the lessons that you plan. They say things about you as a teacher and you as a person. So be very aware of how you talk. And we'll talk more about that in class and in our online workshops around questioning and feedback later in the semester. So that's all for this particular online lecture. Hope you have a great week this week, everyone.